Hello and welcome to my Nutrient Nirvana channel. In this video, friend to the channel and regular guest Ralph Ellis will be joining us, as will author and researcher Dan Unterbrink. Dan published his first book, Judas the Galilean, back in 2004, where he put forward his theory that the historical Jesus Christ was in fact Judas the Galilean, leader and creator of the full philosophy of Judaism as recorded by Josephus. Since then, Dan has released 3 more books, New Testament Lies, The Three Messiahs, and his new book, Judas of Nazareth, which summarizes the findings in his previous books, as well as adding significant insights into the formation of the gospel story and the life of Paul. Ralph Ellis requires little introduction to my regular viewers, but for any newcomers, Ralph has written a 4-part trilogy on the historical Jesus, where he identifies King Isas Manu of Edessa as the historical Jesus Christ. Although both men identify a different character as the historical Jesus and place him in a different era, they share quite a few commonalities in their research, so this should be a very entertaining and thought-provoking discussion. I hope you enjoy it, and do please give the video a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Thanks for watching. Hello, Daniel. How are you today, sir?
Hi, Paul. I'm fine. Thanks for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure. Really looking forward to this. So, Daniel, you've got 10 minutes to give us your synopsis on who you think was the historical Christ. I'll give you the floor.
Okay, back around 2003, I decided I was looking at the New Testament and the birth narratives of Jesus. The one in Matthew was around 4 BC. The one in Luke was like 6 AD. And I was thinking, well, you know, I was going to look through Josephus. And I was looking through that, and I saw a character that named Judas that was had major events in his life in 4 BC and 6 AD. In 4 BC, it was the Golden Eagle temple cleansing. Here, Judas and his father or his co-teacher cleansed the temple, which is kind of interesting when you consider Jesus cleansed the temple. And then in 6 AD, he led a tax revolt against the Romans. And that is also interesting when you look at Luke. Jesus was put to death because he was telling people not to pay their taxes to Rome. So at that point, I was very interested in finding more out about this Judas character. So, you know, I was going through Josephus and just looking at the items about him, and not only him, but his followers, all the way to 70 AD. And I compiled a list of around 40 similarities between Judas and Jesus. And then, you know, that's one thing, you know, and I've seen other people compare, you know, like Julius Caesar to Jesus, or different people to Jesus. And so it wasn't just the idea that there were similarities, but then you had to get a timeline. A timeline is very important because according to the New Testament, Jesus was born, you know, sometime around 4 BC, and supposedly starts his ministry in 28, 29 AD, and is then put to death sometime between 30 and 33 AD. So I needed to look at John the Baptist. I needed to look at James. I needed to look at Paul to see where their timelines were. And it seems that, you know, if we start with Paul, because we have more information about him than anyone else, the way the traditional storyline on Paul goes, that he becomes a disciple shortly after the death of Jesus, around 35 AD, and then he's in the movement for 17 years, because he talks about being in the movement for 17 years. So you're at least at 52, and then supposedly he goes to Rome around 60 AD. So, you know, I wanted to see if that, you know, held water. So there's a passage in Josephus which talks about a fellow named Elias, that Ananias, that was teaching King Isaides a superior form of turning into a Jew. Instead of circumcision, it would have been just faith. And this was Paul's theology. And then Paul in Galatians 2 also talks about him being confronted by Peter in Antioch. And most people would date that into the 50s. But the date in Josephus for this exact same type of thing with Isaides was 44 AD. So if we date the Galatians and what happened in Antioch to 44 AD, if you use that 17 years, the absolute latest that Paul could have joined the movement would have been 27. And you know that it was probably in the early 20s upon my reckoning that Paul joined the movement. So you've got one case here where the timeline, the traditional timeline, just doesn't make sense. And then you look at John the Baptist. John the Baptist, according to Josephus, is put to death in 36 AD. Again, this is totally different than the Gospels, which have him dying before Jesus around 30, 31 AD. So we've got the death different, date different. And then around 2005, I wrote a second book, and I incorporated information from the Slavonic Josephus. I learned of this from Professor Eisenman, and he talked about a lot of scholars don't accept that, but he thought that there was enough good information there as there was in the Gospel. So I said, what the heck? I'll take a look at it. So I started looking at the Slavonic Josephus, and there's passages about John the Baptist that have him starting to preach in 6 AD. Okay, this is the exact time that Josephus introduces a character named Sadduc, who was a righteous teacher that was a co-teacher with Judas the Galilean. So if you move that back, and then the Mandeans, the followers of John the Baptist, have a tradition that he taught for like 42 years. Okay, so if he died in 36, you can bring his ministry all the way back to about 5-6 BC. Okay, so this is a totally different viewpoint than the traditional, where these guys come on the scene in 30, put to death, and then that's it. These guys were teaching for a very long time. So essentially what I've done is I've built a lot of flesh on those bones. And to get all the information, I've written 5 books. My last one, the next to last book, was called Judas of Nazareth. And this has pretty much everything that would be interesting for a person to see, with all the similarities between Judas and Jesus, and all the information about the other characters, whether it be James, Paul, or Cephas. So it's very important that you study that, because then you're going to see that there are some things that people believe about the New Testament that are just not true. And I'll give you one really good example. You've got with the life of Paul in the New Testament, in the book of Acts, Paul is introduced as Saul, and this is after the stoning of Stephen. And this would have been, like, according to the New Testament, around 35, 37 or whatever AD. Well, in Josephus, there's a Saul character that is introduced by Josephus after the stoning of James, the brother of Jesus. So it's like, okay, is that just a coincidence? But then later in the war, Josephus records Paul doing many of the same things, or Saul doing many of the same things that the Acts has Paul doing. Whether it is meeting with Caesar, he goes to Greece to meet Caesar. He goes to meet the King Agrippa. He's also rescued by the Romans, just as Paul is in Acts. So you've got the character of Paul is essentially is being patterned on the life of this Saul character in Josephus. And Saul also was a member of the Herodian family, which might explain why he had a different teaching than the original disciples of the Jesus character. So to put all those things together, I mean, you can't just in 5 minutes. It's very difficult to explain everything. But looking at each individual item, I think people would get an appreciation that there's something here that scholars have not spent a lot of time with. Now, Eisenman, he touched upon certain things, like he thinks that John the Baptist was the Sadduq, okay, which that's interesting. I think maybe you could ask me some questions at this point, and if there's things that you're not clear on what I'm talking about, maybe we can delve into that right now.
Sure, thank you, Daniel. That was very, very interesting. I do have a few questions for you. So could I start by asking you, when do you think the Gospels were written, and why is there such a large gap?
Okay, in the book Judas of Nazareth, I have several chapters on when I think the Gospels were written. Okay, I think the earliest Gospel was Mark. It was written sometime after the Jewish War, which was in 70 AD. And you got to remember, if I'm right, and Judas the Galilean was the historical Jesus, his movement was pretty much wiped out because the Romans just wiped everyone out. And then when the remnants of his movement, the Sicarii, they went to Masada, okay, and the Romans ended up in 73 AD, killed all of them, or they actually committed suicide. It's interesting that group also was in possession of some of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So this can help explain who wrote, or at least who used, the Dead Sea Scrolls. We know the Sicarii did at Masada. So this was the last gasp of the Jesus movement. Now the Pauline movement was totally different. They taught a totally different gospel. This was a gospel to the Gentiles. The original movement was a totally Jewish movement.
Yeah, okay. Why is Jesus being crucified before John is executed?
I think the gospel writers were trying to kind of downplay the role of John the Baptist. According to my timeline and what Josephus talks about, there's a good chance that Judas the Galilean was put to death around 19 AD. This is where the passage, the supposed passage where Josephus talks about Jesus, is inserted. Well, my theory is that that's probably an original passage about Judas the Galilean, his death. But that would have been like 19. Okay. John lived till 36. So who would have been the leader of the movement for that period of time? It would have been John the Baptist. Mm-hmm. And you get a kind of a sense when Josephus talks about John the Baptist right before he's put to death. He said that the people would have done anything he wanted. In fact, that's why he was put to death, because he was a danger to King Herod, Antipas. So he was a very powerful figure. Now, you compare him to the Gospels, where a couple people visited him while he's in prison, and he's put to death, and that's pretty much it. So he's totally written out of the gospel story, other than him introducing the Jesus character. Okay. So he actually, I think, played a much bigger role in the beginning of the church than what has been given credit for.
Okay, fantastic, thank you. Why was Rome involved in the dispute rather than the local magistrates and local justice?
In the death of Jesus?
Yeah, sorry, in the death of Jesus, yeah.
Yeah. Well, if Judas the Galilean starts a tax revolt against Rome. Okay, Rome, when they occupied territories, their goal was to get as much money out of those territories as taxation. Okay, if you've got rebels that are going against the Roman taxation system, the number one thing that you need to do is get rid of them. So, in the book of Luke, we have Jesus on trial, and the charge against him is he's telling people to not pay their taxes to Rome. And that's why he is put to death. Okay. Of course, in Luke, it says, well, it really wasn't the reason, but they bring it up, and that's one reason. If he was just a love preacher, everyone just love each other and everything, the Romans wouldn't have cared. They would, in fact, he would have been their guy, as long as they could collect their taxes. But if he's teaching people to not pay their taxes, then, he was a threat to the Roman government. And that's why they put him to death. And they put him to death through crucifixion, which is, if you ever watch the movie Spartacus, when those guys are all crucified, it wasn't a pleasant way to go.
No.
So they were teaching other people, don't do this, we're serious.
I'm currently reading your book, Judas the Galilean, which I'm really enjoying. It's a fantastic book, and I highly encourage people that are watching this to go out and get it. So can you explain what the Council of Jerusalem is and what the connection was with Judas the Galilean's full philosophy?
Okay, the Council of Jerusalem, according to the book of Acts, or even Paul's letter to the Galatians, Paul gives it in his eyes, it was to talk about whether or not Gentiles should be allowed into the movement. Okay. And that might have been part of the council, but I don't think it was the main part. Remember, we talked about John the Baptist dying in 36?
Yep.
Who was going to take over at that point? The Jesus character, Judas the Galilean, had already been put to death by crucifixion in 19. 36, John the Baptist is beheaded. He's put to death. Okay, who's going to be the leader of the church at that point? Okay, that's what the Council of Jerusalem was for. It was to consolidate support for James, who was the brother of the Jesus character. Yeah. And it's interesting that he lived until 62 AD. And one of the church historians, and I have this in my books, mentioned that he was the head of the movement for 24 years. Okay, wow. Yep. 62 minus 24 is 38. So you can pretty much time the Council of Jerusalem to that point. Okay, he becomes the head of the movement at that point. So I think that's what the Council of Jerusalem primary purpose was. Secondary purpose, and Paul, everything from Paul's point of view was, he was looking at himself. I'm teaching this new gospel to the, he was so secondary to the Jerusalem people that it was, they might have listened to him, but it was no big deal. They didn't get really concerned about him until, maybe 6-7 years later. And then they finally put an end to what he was teaching.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, brilliant. You have an interesting take on Jesus having children.
Oh, yeah.
Could you expand on that at all for us?
Well, Judas the Galilean, he had two sons, James and Simon, who were crucified by the Romans in around 44, 46 AD. He had another son that goes to Jerusalem, just like the Jesus character in 66 AD. And then he has a grandson or a descendant that leads the group at Masada in 73. So the whole history of what's going on in Jerusalem at this time and all the uproar related to Judas the Galilean.
Mhm.
You know, and like I said, I believe that he was the Jesus character that the whole thing is based on. You know, in 70 AD, you can't really preach a Jesus, a real Jesus, because the Romans wouldn't allow it. But the Pauline version of Jesus was, you know, oh, you know, you're going to go to heaven and all this stuff. That then becomes the religion that what we have today. But it wasn't the original. The original was much different. You know, they shared everything they had in common. You know, the pure communism, and Josephus would even talk about the followers, the zealots of being crazy, because he said they'd give everything they had, you know, and they'd just be paupers afterwards. Well, you read the first couple chapters of Acts, and that's exactly what the followers of this Jesus character were doing. They were giving everything they could for everyone else. You know, even when Jesus feeds the 5,000, you know, it's not a type of story where, oh, he's creating loaves and he's creating fish out of thin air. He was giving them the example to share with one another, so that the people that did bring food shared with the people that did not have food. And then there were pieces left over because there was enough food there. It was just that some people had a lot and some people had none. But when they were sharing, see, that makes sense.
It does, yeah.
The common idea of, you know, this creation of stuff out of thin air, that's not true.
Yeah,
So what Josephus describes as the zealot movement looks very similar to what the actual Jewish Jesus movement was.
Brilliant. Okay, thanks for that, Daniel. I'm going to take you off the screen now and allow Ralph to give us his synopsis, and then I'll get you both on screen afterwards. Okay.
Okay, sounds good.
Cheers. Hi, Ralph.
Hi there.
Good to have you back on the channel.
Indeed.
So, could you give us 5 to 10 minutes on who you think was the historical Christ?
Yes, well, I'm following a parallel track here to Daniel's theory, except basically I'm just going one generation further on. So Daniel has identified the Jesus character as being Judas the Galilean, who was also called Judas the Gaulonite, and he was Judas of Gamala was his other name. So he has 3 different titles. And the next character in succession, the next generation on, was Jesus of Gamala. So we have 2 characters. We have Judas of Gamala and then Jesus of Gamala. And they're quite possibly related. So we might be talking like a father and son, or we might be talking an uncle and a nephew, but they were the next generation on. And what I have done is I've taken the Jesus character to be Jesus of Gamala, who would have been active in the 50s and 60s instead of the, you know, like the 20s and 30s. So we're talking one generation further along. And I think I have less distortions to the chronology. We were talking here about the chronology. Your conflation of names has to make a viable chronology, a narrative that has to work within the context of the gospel story. And yes, that's true, but I think my chronology and my narrative probably works a little bit better. Well, I would say that, wouldn't I? It's my theory. But anyway, I end up with less, I think, distortions to the story. So Daniel was talking there about the chronology of John and Jesus. So under his scenario, he has Jesus having to be crucified before the John character, and then an awful long wait before all of this was actually written down. So we have like 30 years before this is actually written down into gospel form. I don't have that problem because I have John being executed in AD 35, very much the same. It's the same story. And then the Jesus character, the Jesus of Gamala character, who's linked with the city of Edessa, is not crucified until AD 70. And so the chronology is sequential. It's obviously much later than Christians would normally ascribe to the death of Jesus, but the chronology works. And you get no gap because the Gospels are written immediately after this execution. And of course, the Jesus of Gamala character, what I call the prince or king of Edessa, he was crucified. And we have that crucifixion story from Josephus Flavius. So Josephus says that the three leaders of the revolt were crucified after the Jewish revolt. And he comes along, this is Josephus himself, as an army commander of Rome. He comes along, he's aghast that they're being crucified. So he goes to the governor and says, look, can I take them down early? Permission is granted. And so Josephus takes the three leaders of the revolt down from the cross early, just like the Gospels. Two of them die and one of them survives. So we have a passion of the Jesus character, but that didn't happen until AD 70, after the Jewish revolt, and then the Gospels were written immediately afterwards. So although I have this big gap in the chronology from the traditional viewpoint, what I call the chronological chasm, the actual chronology that it's telling actually flows rather better if you understand that the ministry of Jesus was in the 50s and 60s and not in the 20s and 30s. So that's the difference between us. And one of the central components that, again, Daniel was just talking about there was the Council of Jerusalem. I wonder if we ought to introduce some other aspects. Well, no, let's just go through this. The Council of Jerusalem is sort of central to this story. And it's pretty much as Daniel was explaining there, but also within his books and within my books as well, he has this link between the Council of Jerusalem and the Edessan Council of Jerusalem, you might call it. So for listeners who are not sure about what this council was, it was a discussion actually about circumcision. So as was sort of explained before, there were some people that went up from Jerusalem to Antioch, and the first lot were saying that circumcision was not required, and then the second lot were more fundamentalist and said that circumcision was required for the people of Antioch to be converted into Judaism. And Saul and Barnabas were highly against this, and they had this big argument. And so they sent deputies down to Jerusalem to find out what the people in Jerusalem were saying about this, specifically James, of course. And so they traveled off down to Jerusalem to have a discussion about whether circumcision was required or not. And James, in the end, says that no, circumcision wasn't required for these Gentiles to join what I call simple Judaism. But we have exactly the same story from Josephus' Antiquities about the Adiabeni. So there were ambassadors went up from Jerusalem to Adiabeni. They had Ananias, who said circumcision was not required. And then they had Eleazar, who said that circumcision was required. And it's quite obvious that this is the same story about the same event. This big discussion over circumcision, was it required for proselyte Jews, people who wanted to convert to Judaism. And this is interesting because what it means is that the Adiabeni royal family and Saul and Barnabas were intimately linked, because it was Saul and Barnabas who went from Antioch down to Jerusalem to discuss this problem with circumcision. And the other thing I want to introduce into this as well, because Daniel doesn't talk about this, is that Antioch was Antioch Edessa. So the full name of Edessa was Antioch Edessa. And so what we're saying here is that Saul and Barnabas were a component of the Edessan royal family. And Edessa being just in northern Syria, it's just up beyond, just slightly north of Aleppo. And throughout my books, I've said that Edessa is central to the gospel story. And this is one of the aspects that tells us that Edessa was central to the story. And just in case there's any confusion there, because we were talking about Adiabeni, the Syriac historians say that Queen Helena of Adiabeni was married to King Abgarus of Edessa. So when we're talking about Adiabeni, I always sort of link it as being Edessa Adiabeni or Adiabeni Edessa, because those two provinces were intimately linked. They had the same queen. I think they were just actually one province myself. I think it was just Edessa over in northern Syria. But the interesting thing about this story of the Council of Jerusalem and other things that we can come to discuss afterwards was that Saul and Barnabas were intimately linked to the Edessan royal family. They were the ambassadors of that royal family. They're the ones who went from this royal family who were being converted to Judaism. And they went down to Jerusalem to sort out whether circumcision was required or not. And that sort of changes the story, because now we know who this Saul character was. You know, he's a nebulous character who is very formative in the formation of Christianity, of course, but we don't know much about him. But now, through this and other links that we can discuss in a minute, we can see that he was intimately linked to the Edessan royal family. So that is my introduction, and perhaps we could discuss that aspect a little bit further, maybe?
Yes, certainly, Ralph. Brilliant. Just before we do, I have just one question for you on Jesus of Gamala. So you're identifying Jesus of Gamala and Isas Manu as being a historical Christ. So Jesus of Gamala's father was, Jesus of Gamala's father was Judas of Gamala. That's what we're saying. And Isas Manu's father was Agbarus V. But they both have significantly different death dates, don't they?
No, I don't think so. I'm not entirely sure that Judas of Gamala, which is Judas the Galilean, the chap that Daniel was talking about, I'm not entirely sure he can be the father, because if he's linked to King Abgarus of Edessa, he was restrained into Edessa by the Romans. They wouldn't let him out of Edessa. So if this Judas character was actually active in Judea, then they can't be the same. They must be something like an uncle and a nephew, perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there is no reason why their death dates can't be very similar. The traditional death date for Abgarus is given at about AD 50. And I think that's probably true for the Judas character as well, because unlike Daniel, who puts the Judas revolt back into AD 6, and then the Council of Jerusalem in AD 44, I put the Council of Jerusalem in AD 54, which is more the traditional date that is often given in textbooks. And I don't put the Judas revolt into AD 6. he arrived in AD 6, but I don't think his revolt was in AD 6. So his revolt was in the AD 40s, because whenever you read about his revolt, it's always linked to just before the famine and just before the Jewish revolt. And the famine, we know, well, we pretty much know, was around AD 48, and the revolt was in AD 66. So if you're mentioning the Judas revolt, then the famine, then the Jewish revolt, it rather suggests that the Judas revolt was in the sort of AD 40s. And then the guy would have died in the AD 50s, early AD 50s.
Yeah.
So I think the chronology does tie up, but only if we assume that the Judas revolt was in the AD 40s.
Okay. Thanks, Ralph. Okay, so now we're going to have an open discussion on the historical Jesus Christ with Dan and Ralph. Away you go, chaps. So who would like to start?
Well, perhaps I can throw a question across to Daniel, because as we said before, there's similarities between our two theses. Dan is focusing on Judas the Galilean, who is Judas of Gamala, and I'm focusing on Jesus of Gamala, sort of the next generation along. So the question would be, the first one, I suppose, is Judas the Galilean. So he's sort of early 1st century. So is he going to be connected at all with the Babylonian Jews who arrived in Judeo-Syria in the early part of the 1st century?
Not sure if I have an answer to that. I think from what we know from Josephus, Judas is a character that can probably, his birth would be somewhere around 2030 BC. He was around during the Golden Eagle Temple cleansing, which was in 405 BC. And then he is also leading a tax revolt in 6 AD. And according to the Slavonic Josephus, John the Baptist is also being introduced in 6 AD at the time of the census, right at the same time with Judas the Galilean. And that ties in with Antiquities, where Josephus has Judas the Galilean coming in 6 AD with a co-teacher named Sadduc, which is another term for a righteous teacher. And Josephus also said that John was a teacher of righteousness. So there's a good chance that John the Baptist was Sadduc, who was the co-teacher with Judas the Galilean, and that the Gospels have kind of done a sleight of hand, and they've kind of written John the Baptist pretty much out of the story. But he was an important factor in the early church.
But regarding Zadok, Zadok means justice. And James, of course, was James the Just. So could we not move that into the next generation and say the Zadok was the James type character?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's possible. I mean, just because one person has a characteristic doesn't mean somebody else couldn't also. Eisman has written a book, about James the Just, and he goes into huge detail about, how much, how revered he was and how pious he was. But again, that doesn't mean that John the Baptist was not also a character with the same type of leanings. So, I would think that they could both be along those lines of being called, a teacher of righteousness.
Yeah. Homing in, I'm going to sort of edge us towards the Edessa story in a little bit, but I was reading in your book about Jesus coming from Nazareth. So we're now talking about the next generation. Oh, no, sorry. You're saying that Judas was the Jesus character. So Jesus was from Nazareth. Now, was Jesus from Nazareth, the town, or was he the Nazarene, a Nazarite, rather than being from the town?
Yeah, I'm not sure the town. It's nowhere found in the story of Josephus. Not sure that Nazarite or Nazarene wasn't just made Nazareth for the gospel story. So no, I think it was more of a way of life as opposed to a town.
Yeah, just for readers and listeners, just to describe this a little bit more, the Nazarene have been linked to the Nazarite, who was an Old Testament sect, and they are known as the separated ones, and they don't cut their hair, hence the Jesus character has long hair, and they don't bury the dead when they're during their days of separation, which is similar to Jesus saying, Jesus said, follow me and let the dead bury the dead, which is exactly what the Nazarene and the Nazarite would do. And Adam Clarke, who's the 19th century theologian, he says, from the Nazarites sprang the Rechabites, and from the Rechabites the Essene, and then the Anchorites and the Hermits, and then the monastic orders of the Christian fellowship. So that's sort of describing who the Nazarites and the Nazarene were. They were sort of like monks in a monastery sort of thing. And I think that would suit the sort of Jesus and Judas characters very well.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's interesting if you look in Josephus's descriptions of the Essenes and Judas's fourth philosophy. Yes. A lot of times the information overlaps. In war, he spends most of his time talking about the Essenes, but in Antiquities of the Jews, he just barely touches on the Essenes, and he spends all his time talking about Judas's fourth philosophy.
Yes,
and it's very easy to get them confused, or maybe one was the other, or he also talked about two sects of Essenes, one that married and one that didn't. Judas's group married because Judas had sons, he had a wife, he had brothers. So that would be different than the Jesus story, where although Jesus didn't marry in the gospel story, all of his disciples were married. So
yes.
You have to try to explain that one if you're trying to hold on to the old gospel story.
Well, of course, if we link Jesus with Jesus of Gamala, as I do in my books, then Jesus did marry, because Jesus of Gamala married Mary Magdalene. And that's taken from a combination of my books and Robert Eisenman, who equates Mary Boethus with Mary Magdalene. And of course, it was Mary Boethus who married Jesus of Gamala. So I'm talking about the next generation here to you, of course. I'm talking about Jesus of Gamala instead of Judas of Gamala. Just to explain again to listeners if they're confused, Judas the Galilean was also called Judas of Gamala. So he had two titles. And you were talking about the Essene. The Essene, of course, were known as the sons of Zadok. And of course, that would suit your link to Judas of Gamala very well, because he was allied to Zadok.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with that. The one thing when we talk about the sons of Judas the Galilean, Josephus does give us a number of their names. Two of them were crucified in around 46, 47 AD, and that is very close to the passage that you're fond of, the one with Eleazar and Ananias and King Isaides. It's right after that passage where the sons of Judas the Galilean are crucified. And well, one thing I really would like to talk about is the New Testament approach to Judas the Galilean. In Acts 5:33 through 39, the New Testament, the book of Acts, talks about a Theudas and a Judas the Galilean. And this is supposedly coming from the mouth of Gamaliel in around 35 AD. He's talking about Theudas and Judas the Galilean that had preceded him. But by Josephus's account, Theudas came and was put to death in 44 to 46 AD, and the sons of Judas the Galilean were killed right after him. And so the book of Acts is what they're doing is they're distorting the historical facts. They're saying that Judas the Galilean was after Theudas, and that's not true. It was the sons of Judas the Galilean. And, I think that's very important because a lot of people think that Judas led the tax revolt in 6 AD, and all of a sudden, he's put to death and the whole movement falls apart because it also says that Judas is killed and all his followers were scattered. So we make the assumption that Judas was done at that point. But it's interesting that Luke does not say that Jesus's disciples are scattered, but yet Mark and Matthew both say that when Jesus is arrested, his disciples were scattered. They left. So Luke, if he does Luke Acts, they are doing ascribing to Judas the Galilean what was ascribed to Jesus in both Mark and Matthew. So I thought that that's kind of interesting tidbit as well.
Yes, well, there is a little bit of discussion to be had over the dating of Theudas, because of course you say he was involved in a tax revolt in AD 6, but a lot of when they mention Judas, they mention him in the 40s, and of course Acts of the Apostles does that, because Acts of the Apostles said he rose up after Theudas. In Acts of the Apostles.
But they're confusing the writer of Acts is confusing Judas the Galilean with the sons of Judas the Galilean. Mm-hmm. It's the sons of Judas the Galilean that are mentioned right after Theudas in Antiquities.
Yeah, that's possible.
They're
but
the ones that are put to death.
But of course, the sons of Judas were James and Simon, weren't they?
Those two, yeah.
Who are the brothers of Jesus. So if you had...
Well, he could have had... Jesus had brothers. We know one of them is James. We don't know exactly what the other names are.
James, Jude, Joseph, and Simon, according to the Gospels.
Yeah. Okay, when we look at... when Paul talks about the leaders of the movement, he's talking about Cephas, or Peter, James, and John. And James and John are the brothers.
Yeah, but well, yes, but at the cross, at the crucifixion, he calls his brothers James, Jude, Joseph, and Simon. I'll get a quote on that. But the other thing I want to quickly note before I forget about it is when the sons were crucified, it says they were sent for crucifixion. So we don't know necessarily that they were actually crucified and maybe didn't have a reprieve or something of that nature. So it's not necessarily gospel that they were actually died in the late AD 40s.
Well, I guess anything's possible.
Well, it just says that they were sent for crucifixion. So
okay, my guess is the way the Romans did stuff, they were crucified.
Right.
This was right after the death of Agrippa the First. So, while Agrippa was in charge, it seemed like the Jewish Christians, or the followers of Judas, as I would say it, they were kind of biding their time. But once he died, then they started going out and doing different things. And I think that might have been one of the reasons why these guys are being captured and being put to death. I think the Romans were trying to put a lid on things. So, but
the Romans were playing whack-a-mole with revolutionaries all the time. So yes, this was quite standard for them.
But
just going back to the,
just let them go. I mean, putting them to death was an efficient way of doing business, according to the Romans.
Yes, but letting them go was a standard practice in the Roman world, because governors of Judea and Syria and wherever used it as a means of gaining wealth, because they wouldn't let them go. Of course, they would ransom them, and the ransom would go to the governor, and so he could make himself rich. And Josephus explains this when Jesus of Gamala was captured and ransomed, and then he was let go by Agrippa. So Agrippa was doing the same thing. He was ransoming Jesus of Gamala for cash to make himself rich, because most of these people who were revolutionaries were obviously quite wealthy.
But I think it could depend on the reach that the individual had. In the case of John the Baptist, it said that Herod Antipas was actually kind of afraid of John because he had such a huge following throughout Judea. So it was like in Galilee. So he put him to death to try to stamp out that type of a following. If somebody is maybe a small time guy that has money, I could see, trying to get the money out of them. But if it's a matter of preserving your own rule, I think crucifixion or whatever however they were going to kill them was probably the route they would take. But again, it would be probably an individual type thing based on the person and what type of power base that they had.
Just moving on, looking at the Jesus becoming a king, because of course Jesus was called a king. With your Judas being Jesus as against mine, we have the anointing. So Christ means the anointed one, the anointed king. And of course, Jesus was anointed by Mary Magdalene at Bethany, the house of Simon at Bethany. Was this the anointing of Jesus to become a king, to become a Christ?
Well, I think his followers, would have had no trouble with that. They probably did believe that he was, a king, the Christ.
But that would put Mary Magdalene back into the early 1st century instead of the mid 1st century.
I'm not 100% sure on the Mary Magdalene figure, to tell you the truth.
It's just that she was linked to Mary Boethus, of course, and Mary Boethus is an AD 50s and 60s character rather than being an AD 20s character. Although there was another Boethus, of course, at the time of Herod the Great, so there's another confusion.
The Boethus family a lot of them were high priests, weren't they?
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
This chronological chasm, as I call it, with my thesis, has caused a lot of duplications and problems with the chronology. And so you do see this sort of duplication sometimes, and that's probably what we're seeing with the Boethus story.
But one thing I do think is probably a difference in what you're saying and what I'm saying. The Judas the Galilean, in my opinion, was strictly against Rome. He was against the Herodian leadership, and he was against the current high priesthood as it was put together under Herod the Great.
Yes.
These guys were total enemies. And I don't know exactly what your take is on that, but I'd like to hear that.
From my point of view, it's much as Josephus says, actually, that this was largely a tax dispute, because when the Babylonian Jews, who I equate with the fourth sect of Judas of Gamala, when they came and settled there, they were given their lands tax-free by Emperor Augustus and Herod the Great. Well, no, it would be Herod Archelaus, because they arrived in 2 BC. And they were given their lands tax-free. And then later emperors reneged on that and tried to tax them. And that's why, with the fourth sect, they say, you must not pay your taxes. And that's why the Gospels are full of this tax dispute information as well, that Jesus was against, well, they have him doing both, actually. He was against paying taxes to Rome, and then, of course, in the famous verse, he says, render unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar. So a lot of it was actually a tax dispute, not just simply a religious dispute.
But even that passage, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and what is God to God, that can be interpreted to say, give Caesar his money, but give the land back to the Jews, which would have been very problematic for the Romans at that point, because it's saying, take your money and get the heck out, which they weren't going to do. So you can view that passage also as being very anti-Roman as well.
Yes, you can. I do the same, actually, because I say it could have meant render taxes unto Rome that belong to Rome, but render unto the Jesus of Edessa character the taxes that belong to him, because he had his own taxation system, of course, to maintain his own government, being the king of Judea and the king of Edessa. So yes, you can read it in that fashion as well. But we can come on to heading more in the sort of Edessa direction. We come on to the passage about Agabus, who prophesies a famine in Judea and sends famine relief money down to Judea. Now, the guy in Acts that says that is Agabus. And both myself and Robert Eisenman has identified him with King Abgarus of Edessa, because the other famous person who gave this famine relief was Queen Helena.
Right.
And Queen Helena was married to King Abgarus of Edessa. So we have this passage in Acts of the Apostles where famine relief is being given by the Edessan royalty to Judea. And the odd thing is that, of course, that money is taken to Judea by Saul and Barnabas, which rather sort of infers that Saul and Barnabas were the ambassadors of Edessa. They were taking the famine relief money from Edessa down to Judea. And that also sort of vaguely infers that Antioch, because we're going to come on to this in a minute, we have these disciples going backwards and forwards from Judea to Antioch all the time. It rather infers that Antioch was not Antioch Arontes, which is the famous one. It was Antioch Edessa, that they were talking about Edessa. They weren't talking about the standard normal Antioch. And that has a strong bearing on this, because it it introduces the Edessan royal family into the biblical story, into the story of Acts of the Apostles, and what we're going to come on to in a minute, which is the Council of Jerusalem. So I was just wondering, would you agree with Agabus being King Abgarus of Edessa?
Yeah, I have no problem with that. My problem is what the book of Acts has done with, is it Saul and Barnabas that take the money? You know, if you get in, if you go back to Galatians, Paul mentions going to Jerusalem twice. Okay, and he's probably writing sometime after 44, because at 44, he's cut off from the Jerusalem movement. Okay, so he's kind of out on his own, but he never mentions going to Jerusalem with all the money to help the church and everything. I don't think he ever did go. I think Queen Helena sent the money with either she went or, you know, people with her went, but I don't think Paul had anything to do with it. I think at this time, Paul would have been such an outcast from Jerusalem that he wouldn't have dared set foot in the city. And I think he knew that. So there was no way he was going to Jerusalem.
Well, I, instead of 44, like you say, I actually say 54 for this toing and froing from Antioch and the Council of Jerusalem. So we're 10 years different there. But you're right.
The famine was between 44 and 48.
It was 40. Yeah, I say 48. Yeah,
I'd say probably was well. According to Josephus, it happened during the reign of two of the procurators, which went from 44 to 48. So my guess is it was probably starting around 44, 45, maybe ending 47 or 48. But Queen Helena most likely went there at the beginning, you know, right after the King Isaides episode with Ananias. At least that's the way I read Josephus.
The Talmud and Josephus, I think, say that she went there after the war with Emesa, which again I date to 54. So anyway, there's a slight difference there, but it's not terribly important.
It really is, because if the passage about King Isaides being converted is in 44, and if you equate that to what Paul is talking about in Galatians, it totally changes the timeline of the early church.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
So it is a very important point of where Josephus puts that story. It's right after the death of Agrippa I, which was in 44, and the famine is between 44 and 48, and Queen Helena is taking money, and you know, it's like if she's a Jewish convert and her son's a Jewish convert, why would they wait towards the end of the famine? Wouldn't they be trying to help out as soon as they could? So I would say that's closer to the 44 date.
I put the conversion after the famine. So the famine occurs first in 48, and then the conversion episode, the Council of Jerusalem, is later in 54. So we're slightly reversed there, but we're talking about the same events going backwards and forwards. So the important thing is that I think we have three accounts of this toing and froing. So again, for listeners, this is all about the conversion of a people to Judaism, including circumcision. So they're mainly talking about circumcision here, whether they should have full circumcision or not have it at all. And there's moderates and there's hardliners, and they're going backwards and forwards. And we seem to have three versions of this, because we have the version in Antiquities, that's the version by Josephus, and he says that the people going backwards and forwards are Ananias, who's the moderate, and Eleazar, who's the hardliner. Then we have the gospel version, where we have again, we have disciples going backwards and forwards to Antioch, and we have Peter and Saul, who are the moderates, and then the hardliners. I don't know who the hardliners would be. Maybe James, maybe John Mark, I don't know. And then we have the doctrine of Addai, which has the same story. This is an apocryphal gospel from a little bit later, but it also has this letters going backwards and forwards from Edessa, they say this time, not Antioch, going backwards and forwards from Edessa to Jerusalem. And the ambassador in that case is Anan or Hanan, which seems to be the Hananias from Antiquities. It seems to be talking about the same event. So we appear to have three versions of this circumcision episode, which ended up with the Council of Jerusalem.
Have you included the account that Paul gives in Galatians?
Yeah, that's. Yes, I suppose, yes, you've got a separate one in Galatians as well. So there's four.
Right. Yeah. And, I think, I think this happened right after the death of Agrippa, and that the disciples, we used to call them those of the circumcision, or as Eisenman would equate them with the Sicarii, the dagger people. They circumcised with their daggers. Those people were coming from Galilee or from James. One group we know went to visit Cephas and Paul, and another went to the King Isaides episode. So it could have been, it didn't have to be the same episode. It could have been two different groups, but it's happening at the same time. Paul also had a lot of his exploits. He had people do things for him. He had a lot of people working with him. And so, the Ananias character, I think, was associated with Paul, but Paul was doing his own thing at that time. But they both were confronted by the disciples from James that were called the circumcision.
Yeah, but if we do conflate these different stories of what appears to be the same event, then the Ananias character would be Peter, Simon Peter. Don't you think?
It's interesting that the Ananias character is not in favor of circumcision, right?
Yes, which was
okay.
Peter's
Now, if you get
idea.
into Acts, is it Acts 10, where Peter supposedly supports what was the fellow's name, Cornelius, and to become a Jew through faith as opposed to circumcision?
Yeah,
well, there's a parallel passage in Josephus where a Simon, a teacher, bars Agrippa from the temple because he's not fully Jewish. So it's like the book of Acts is almost like you take an event that actually happened and they rework it to make it almost 180 degrees different from what the intent was.
Well, not necessarily, because
I can go through a list of like 15 or 20 passages from Acts, and they're not even close to being true. It's mostly, unless you think that Acts is true and all of Josephus is false. I think Josephus was written before Acts, and I think it makes a lot more sense the way things are going on. For instance, one of the greatest one is when you've got the stoning of Stephen. And after the stoning of Stephen, all of a sudden, Saul is introduced into the story in the beginning of Acts. And this is supposed to take place around 35 AD. The passage in Josephus has Saul being introduced after the stoning of James in 62. And the difference in the two stories is the timing, but one is Saul was persecuting the church before he became a member. In reality, he persecuted the church after he was thrown out. And that is a totally different thing. And that what is that? That's doing is whitewashing the history of Saul.
Well, he's not necessarily
the great apostle, where he would have been the enemy of the church at the end. So it's a totally different thing. And you can go through passage after passage, and they do the same thing.
Yeah, but this is just the chronological chasm where things have been repeated because the story has been dislocated from its original timeline. And most of these differences are 40 years, like this one is 30 years. But with Peter, of course, yes, you can make Peter being on both sides of this circumcision debate, but he was being totally duplicitous. That was just Peter. When Peter was up with Saul, he was acting as a simple Judaist. He wasn't abiding by Judaism. And then when the hardliners came up from Jerusalem, he suddenly turned against Saul and started being properly kosher again.
Well, that's Saul's point of view, and unfortunately, we don't have Peter's point of view on that.
Well, no, we don't.
My guess is this is from Corinthians, where Paul says, to the Jews I act like a Jew, to the those that follow the law I act like one following the law.
Yes.
So there's a good chance that Peter didn't know exactly what Paul was preaching at that point until representatives from James came and told him. And at that point, he said, all the Jews turned their backs on me, even Barnabas. So the later story about Barnabas in Acts 15, where he is supposedly has a fight with Paul, has nothing to do with why he actually left the side of Paul, because he left because he was following the teachings of James as opposed to the teachings of Paul. And Paul insisted that his gospel did not come from any man. He didn't learn it from Peter. He didn't learn it from James. He said he learned it through revelation, through the risen Christ. So it's like, here's a guy with visions, and the people today take him as being the one that was actually on the right side of it. Not, the Jews would have looked at him as being, a complete lunatic or a liar. And that's one reason why Paul always talks about in his gospel or his epistles, he says, I'm not lying. Well, somebody was saying he was lying.
Same as Josephus does. Yeah. But going back to the Council of Jerusalem, it was at the Council of Jerusalem that Saul, St. Paul, Saul, devised his new Judaism for Gentiles. So he was the moderate, of course, and he devised Judaism for Gentiles, which became Christianity eventually. But this was sanctioned and decided at the Council of Jerusalem by James. And then Saul and Barnabas were sent back to Antioch Edessa, to go and say to them that you don't need circumcision. So this has to be surely just before Saul's second evangelical tour of the Mediterranean, where he went around teaching simple Judaism for Gentiles. So that would place the Council of Jerusalem in about AD 54, would it not?
I think the Council in Jerusalem can be placed around 38.
But that means
the important thing about the council was not Paul. He was a secondary issue. The important thing was who was going to replace John the Baptist as leader of the movement. And John the Baptist died around 36. And even in Corinthians, you have Paul talking about divisions in the church. Some people follow Apollos, who was the water baptism person. Some people follow him. Some people follow James or Cephas. So, the idea that this whole council was based on Paul, I think is very, very unlikely. I think he was a side issue, And I think he did his best to show the Jerusalem apostles that he was going to teach Judaism. It was more like if the Gentiles were going to become full members of the group, they would be circumcised. If they were going to be like the God-fearers, that they were still going to be accepted, but they wouldn't have full membership into the group. You know,
Yeah,
I think they would have been happy with that. But what happens is Paul starts going beyond that when he is preaching to people. He's saying that the true members are the ones that are through faith, and that read Galatians 4. After he's talking about all this stuff, he's talking about the Jews being the offspring of Hagar, being the slave woman. So there's no way that the Jews at that point in Jerusalem, in Galilee, are going to be accepting Paul. He has gone way beyond what they would have agreed upon. And I think that's why they put the halt to what he was doing. And at that point, he's kicked out of the movement.
And that's when he was put into prison, but that was in the AD 50s again.
I'm not sure. I really don't believe much of anything in the book of Acts, to tell you the truth. I think most of the book of Acts is a rewriting of events from Josephus to try to make it so that Paul is not the bad guy of the story. The stoning of James, if he's persecuting the poorer priests and the people after the stoning of James, then he is the evil one. But if you move it to what Acts did, and now he's persecuting the church after the stoning of Stephen before his conversion, then that's okay. Now he's a good Christian after that. But if you look at it by Josephus's history, that is not the case. He is fighting against the church in the early 60s. And then there's stories also about him going to see Agrippa and Caesar and being saved by the Romans, the same stories that they write about Paul in the later chapters of Acts. So it's like you can believe one or the other. I happen to believe the account that Josephus talks about when he's talking about Saul.
But Saul was against the church. That was the whole point, that he had set up his own new church for Gentiles, his simple Judaism, and he was now opposing.
It didn't have to be that way, because at the council, which I think was earlier, I think they had come upon an agreement that the Gentiles would be accepted in as full Jews if they followed, circumcision and all the law. But knowing that they probably wouldn't, then they would have a little bit of leeway there. But Paul went totally off the board there. I mean, he said that they didn't have to have anything to do with the law.
Yeah, and that's why
that wasn't accurate teaching for what the James would have accepted at that point.
And that's why they had the argument with James, and why James was stoned. That's the whole point, that Saul had made up his new Gentile church, which was now opposing the Nazarene church of Jesus and James, and they were at each other's throats.
But I think that was more, I don't know if they were at each other's throats at that point. Saul was making probably a lot of money off his Gentile followers, but when he came back to Jerusalem, he didn't have his Gentile followers with him. They were the Jews that were following James and the Sicarii, and Josephus's description of them. I mean, he had reason to fear for his life when he was in Jerusalem at the end there.
Well, yes, because that's why they put him in jail. But again, that was the AD 50s.
The idea that he went back. Are you talking about the time? Okay, he's in jail, and it's kind of a retelling of the story of Simon being in jail. It's a similar kind of thing. I'm not sure.
Well, I was thinking of the time when he was in jail and he was seen by Felix, and Agrippa II came, and was it Festus who was the other one who came to see him?
Oh, okay. You're talking about that would have been when he appealed to Caesar, right?
Yes.
Okay. Well, in Josephus's story, Saul is a free man during this time. He escapes Jerusalem with the help of the Romans. Now, in the Acts story, the Romans save Paul, but they're also helping Saul. He also meets with Agrippa to try to bring a war party to wipe out the followers of Judas the Galilean. And then he goes to modern day Greece to meet with Caesar. So he was never in prison. That is a falsehood put forward by the
yeah, but that was afterwards. That was after he had been to see Nero. In my chronology, he was in jail from about 55 to 62. He went to see Nero in 63, and then he went to see Nero in Greece, and that would have been in 66, because that was talking about the Jewish revolt. The whole reason for going to see Nero in Greece was to appraise them of what was happening in the lead up to the Jewish revolt. So that would have been 65, 66. So that was much later.
I personally think that there was. I don't think he was ever in jail, to tell you the truth.
Well, we have this big story.
Josephus match up almost perfectly with the Book of Acts, and to make them into two different events, I don't think is accurate.
Well, we have this big story about in Acts of Saul being in prison, and he's visited by Festus and Felix and Agrippa II and Berenike. And Felix wants a bribe from him, which indicates he was very rich. So the question is, why would these governors and the king of Judea come to Saul to see him in prison if he was just a tent maker?
I don't think he was a tent maker. I think at this point,
I
think he was very rich at this time.
Right.
Which is saying that he had an entire, when he was preaching to the Gentiles, he told them to save up every week whatever they could afford. If you were richer, you got more than if you were poor, you gave a little less. But then he would, at the end of the year, whenever they would take the money and take it to the saints in Jerusalem. Now, whether that money ever got there, I don't know. He also used to have one group compete against the others. He'd say, "Oh, those in Macedonia are, giving all this money. You in Galatia can do even better." So he was making a competition amongst his disciples of who could give the most money. It's like the greatest of the con men that you would look today on the preaching the good news. It's just unbelievable, and how much money he actually ended up pocketing, who knows? But by 62 A.D., when Stephen or James is put to death, he has money because he's hobnobbing with the high priests and the top guys there in Jerusalem.
Yeah, I mean, he was like a modern televangelist, of course. He was taking money from everybody. But more important than that, perhaps, is I think he was related to the royalty as well, the royalty of Adia Beni Edessa. And that's why he was called a tent maker, because I think he wasn't a tent maker. He was a Sukkot maker for the festival of Sukkot.
Josephus calls them of the Herodian family. So yes. he was Herodian.
No, I think he says Hasmonean, I think. Anyway, one of the two. But if he was the Sukkot maker for the festival of Sukkots, Queen Helena of Edessa was known for having the largest Sukkot in the whole of the Near East. So again, that could be the reason why he was called a tent maker. They've just mistranslated it.
That's possible.
And again, this would...
One other interesting point about when we're talking about the end of Saul's career, there's an episode where he's got a nephew that helps him out to escape.
Yes.
You remember that episode in
Yes.
Acts? The Saul of Josephus, the nephew would have been the temple treasurer. So that might give you an idea why the nephew had some pull, and
yes.
helped him out. So, and you can look at the timelines that Eisenman has for that. He spells that out pretty nicely. So
And what was the
Paul
name
had
of the
some real
temple
connections.
treasurer?
He was the temple treasurer.
What was his name?
Off the top of my head, I can't remember.
Because there was a temple treasurer that was supposed to be responsible for the death of Jesus of Gamala as well. So then I'll have to look that one up. Just coming on to Judas the Galilean again. Was he Judas of Galilee or Judas the Galilean? So was that, again, is that the name of a town or the name of a religious sect?
I think it was probably maybe not a town, but an area, and I depending on where he was born, I'm not 100% sure. There are conflicting reports in Josephus. What he was probably known as the Galilean, just like when we talk about Nazareth, Nazarene, the sect of Galileans or this or that. So I don't think it maybe you can pinpoint the exact place where they were from, but their philosophy was based on pretty much getting rid of the Roman rule. They wanted to have their own religion, free from the Romans.
Yeah, it's just that, of course, he was called Judas the Galilean, and the Galileans were known for being castrated. They were eunuchs. And of course, Jesus in Matthew 19:11, he asks for his disciples to castrate themselves. And Jesus was known as a Galilean, and so was Peter. Peter was called the Galilean. And here is Jesus in Matthew 19:11 asking for his disciples to castrate themselves. Jesus said, "All man cannot receive this saying except those to whom it is given. For there are some eunuchs who were born from their mother's womb, and there are some eunuchs who were made eunuchs by men, and there are some eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. He that is able to receive it, let him receive it." And so it's quite clear that he was asking his disciples to become eunuchs, because that was the Galilee priests, and the Galileans were known as eunuchs.
Well, I don't think Judas the Galilean was not a eunuch because he had kids.
Oh yeah, but they became eunuchs in later life. They didn't become eunuchs from birth. It's only when they became high priest or priest.
And Paul also talks about, he said, "I'm the only one that's not married. All the other apostles have wives and stuff." So you would think that
it would be the Peter character who would be the eunuch, because Peter was called the Galilean, and also they had that ceremony up on the Mount of Olives where there was a naked boy and so on. What was the naked boy doing? It was probably this rite of being made a eunuch.
Well, I don't know. Josephus talks about the one group of Essenes that preached having kids, because otherwise the logic of if everybody is a eunuch, nobody's going to have kids, and
I think it was reserved more for the. Yeah, I think it was reserved more for the high priesthood than the laity. But Josephus also says of the Galileans, and he specifically says they are Galileans. He says the Galileans indulged themselves in feminine wantonness. They decked their hair and put on women's garments and smeared themselves with ointments that they might appear very comely. They had paints under their eyes and imitated not only the ornaments but also the lusts of women. But while their faces looked like the faces of women, they killed with their right hands. And while their gait was effeminate, they attacked men and became warriors and drew their swords from under their finely decked dresses and ran everybody through that they came upon.
So is this is description of the Sicarii? Well,
yeah, it could be, because it sounds very much like the Sicarii, and it sounds very much like the.
I don't know about the effeminate part, but they're talking about the swords and carrying it underneath their garments. That would have been.
The effeminate part is exactly what they do within Christianity today. Of course, if you go to the Vatican and you watch all the cardinals come into the conclave, they're all dressed in women's dresses. So nothing has changed. They're doing exactly the same as the Galileans did back in the 1st century.
Well, I have trouble putting Judas the Galilean in that type of a
well,
mold.
I mean, they are warriors as well. They're just warriors. They're warriors in dresses. That's all.
Okay. There is one other passage which I think is interesting that we could shoot back and forth. It's the passage where the sons of Zebedee, the mother comes up and she wants to have one of her sons become to be at Jesus' right hand and one at the left hand. And then Jesus says, can you drink the same cup that I'm going to drink? Which is crucifixion. I've always looked at the, like the sons of thunder, who these guys are supposed to be. If they're the sons of thunder, who was thunder? Their father was, according to Matthew 4, is sitting in a fishing boat, and they leave him, and his wife leaves him too, and that's thunder.
Well,
that sounds like wind.
I think that's just referring to their temperament, that they were the sons of thunder. They were the sort of primary knights of the round table, as it were.
Yeah. Well, and what I think what it was is thunder was Judas the Galilean. These are the sons of Judas the Galilean. And then when the woman, the mother, comes to ask for the favor, it's his wife asking to put one son on the right hand and one son on the left hand of him in his kingdom. And he said, are you going to do the same thing that I'm going to undergo? And, of course, this is backward looking when this is written, but those are the two sons that are being crucified in Antiquities chapter 20. So there are a lot of things that I think makes sense when you're thinking about Judas the Galilean being the center of this thing.
They were probably the sons of the Bronte sisters, because thunder in Greek is Bronte, of course. So they were the sons of the Bronte sisters. But just coming back to the castration business, it's just a quick wonder if this was the central topic of the Council of Jerusalem, because we are assuming that they're correct, that these apostles are going backwards and forwards from Antioch, Edessa down to Jerusalem and back, having this big discussion about whether the king should be circumcised. But if these were Galileans, was the discussion about castration?
No, I think it was discussion. It was about circumcision. Circumcision was the sign of the covenant. So with God, so I don't think it had anything to do with castration. I think it was circumcision.
Because we get a very big similarity with Arthurian legend, and you'll be probably wondering why I'm talking about Arthurian legend. But in Arthurian legend, we have many similarities to this story. And there, they were talking about the wounded king who was wounded between the thighs. And it seemed likely that the wounded king within Arthurian legend was again talking about castration, not circumcision.
Well,
and that was the big discussion, of course, because castration was not allowed within Rome. You could be circumcised within Rome, but castration was forbidden. And therefore, the king of Antioch Edessa, whether he was going to be castrated or not, would be going entirely against Roman law.
Well, that's not a very popular way to recruit people.
No, but the Galli were quite successful in their day. You know, they were quite influential, and they were influential up until the 3rd century. The Romans were still trying to stamp it out in the 3rd century that had all this castration going on. Is that why? Because Peter was called the Galilean, and therefore under this scenario he might have been castrated. And of course Peter was recognized as the Galilean because of his voice. Is that because he had a high-pitched voice? Is that what they were talking about, that he was castrated?
Yeah, I don't know about that. I'm not familiar. I'm not familiar with the stories.
Oh, it just says this comes from Mark 14:70. It says, "And a little after, they that stood by said again to Peter, Surely thou art one of them, for they are a Galilean, and thy speech shows this." Why would the speech depict him as being Galilean? Now they're trying to say it's because he had an accent. But of course, if he was castrated, they might realize that he's a Galilean that way.
Well, yeah, but it very well could be the accent. I mean, I've been told that I sound like I'm from Indiana, and I was born in Northwest Ohio. I've got an Indiana accent. It's like,
oh, yes.
Okay, I've met people from Georgia that I couldn't even understand that they had such a heavy accent. So you could have. I think there's more of a chance that they're talking about you sound like you're from a certain area, a certain dialect or whatever.
Yeah. But we do have this strong allusion to castration going on in the gospel story. So it's just another possibility that people don't look at.
Well, I will. I'll look at it and see what I think. I really hadn't given it much thought, to tell you the truth.
Yes. It's an odd part of the story, but I think these odd things get covered up because people don't like to discuss them, and of course the churches never discuss them because they don't want, if that's what was going on, and Jesus did say that his disciples should get castrated, then of course they're not going to discuss it. So, but it does link up the Church of Jesus and James with the Galileans, who were a particular sect of Judaism, who I say are sort of linked, of course, to the Nazarenes. And the Galli priests, well, again, they wouldn't like this because it's not entirely Judaic. They were the priests of Cybele as well, so they venerated Cybele and Attis. And of course, Attis was castrated just the same. So they would have had a Judaism which was quite peculiarly sort of Egypto-Greek, I suppose you might call it. So not entirely standard Judaism. But then we know that the Nazarene were not standard Judaism as well. Same with the fourth sect. They were positively against the Jerusalem church, the standard Judaism within Jerusalem. So yeah, they could well have been Galli priests. So where else have we got to? What other questions can we have on this? I suppose I've got to ask it, but you've invested in a story, an early first century story with Judas the Galilean, but could the Jesus character be Jesus the Galilean, Jesus of Gamala, the next generation up?
The only problem I see with that is the timeline.
Yes, it alters the timeline, yes.
It's a problem with Judas the Galilean, and then also with the Slavonic Josephus. You've got John the Baptist being on the scene from 6 AD to 36. Judas the Galilean's probably put to death 19. Nobody knows, because for some reason, if Judas, Josephus says that Judas and Sadoc were essentially, everybody went wild for their teachings, even up until the war with Rome, yet he doesn't mention his death. I think that was probably the passage where the passage that's supposed to be about Jesus. I think that was probably originally about Judas the Galilean and his death, about 19 or so, about the time that I think Pilate came into office, around 1819. So,
but you have a problem.
Well, go ahead.
You have a problem with your timeline in that you have Jesus being crucified before John, which goes against the sort of gospel chronology.
Right.
I
totally agree with that.
Yeah, I have John being beheaded before Jesus, because I delay the Jesus crucifixion until AD 70 with the Jewish revolt. So I link the whole of the gospel events around the Jewish revolt. So instead of being the Judas revolt, I link them to the Jesus of Gamala revolt, which was the Great Revolt in AD 66.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I think Judas the Galilean, like I said, he had two sons that were put to death around 46 or 48 AD. He had another son that marched onto Jerusalem, just like the gospel Jesus did, on Palm Sunday. He had, and then he was put to death. And then he had a grandson that takes his group to Masada. So I think the Judas the Galilean character is there in 70 AD. It's just that he himself had been put to death, 50 years earlier.
Yes, we have the story of Menahem, who was holed up in Masada, wasn't he?
Menahem was put to death in Jerusalem, and I think Eleazar was his grandson that went to Masada.
Oh, okay. I thought Menahem was down there as well, but
no,
anyway,
he was put to death.
Was that a son or a grandson? Because
Menahem was a son, and then in Antiquities it calls Menahem, who went to Masada, not Menahem, but Eleazar that went to Masada. They call him a descendant. The Slavonic Josephus says it was a grandson.
Oh, no, I was mistaking this bit where Menahem went down to Masada at the outbreak of the war in AD 66 to take all of, because it was an armory and they wanted arms.
The arms, yeah.
Yeah, they broke into it and took all of the arms from it.
Right.
Yeah, so that was the beginning, not the end. Yeah,
so Judas was really there at the end too. I mean, but I think the movement started and it became, Josephus said it became very powerful through the years. And I think eventually it ended with the end of Judaism as they knew it, because the Romans pretty much.
Judas would have been very old by that time if he was born in 30 BC.
I think he was dead in 19. When Pilate came in.
Oh, I see. Oh, okay, yes.
I think Judas the Galilean was long dead.
Yes, you link him with the Jesus character. Yes, of course.
Right. I think he was dead long before then.
Whereas
But that
I have
also explains, if Jesus was a 40 or 50 character, how can Paul, who is kind of kicked out of the movement in 44, and then he says he joined the movement at least 17 years earlier and probably 25 years earlier, because there was a time between the council and the time that they kick him out of the movement, because he was telling them one thing and they finally discover what he's actually teaching. So you move Paul back into the 20s also. So, there you got John the Baptist in the 20s. You got Paul back in the 20s. Judas the Galilean probably died in 19. We never know exactly for sure, but these characters that are also in Josephus's history are the center of what the New Testament story is. It's just things have been changed around.
Yeah, I tend to have that chronology a little different, because I have Saul equated with Josephus, so he wasn't born until AD 37. And that little quote from Galatians, when he says 17 years after I went down to Jerusalem, that verse or that chapter starts with his birth. So the first thing it says in, was it Galatians 15? I forget what it says now.
Galatians chapter 2, it says that after he is converted as an adult, he goes to Jerusalem 3 years later, and that would have been the standard time, 3 years of training for a new convert. Okay.
Yeah, but what did it say immediately before that?
Before that, he's talking about he had persecuted the church. So he was an adult before he did the 3 years. And then he had another 14 years after that to get to the council. And then in 44, with consistent with the King Isaiah's conversion, he's pretty much kicked out of the movement.
Yeah, but in Galatians 1:15, so immediately before that, he says, when it pleased God who separated me from my mother's womb. And then after 3 years, he goes to Arabia. So that was 3 years after his birth. He goes to Arabia. And Arabia, of course, is Edessa, because Edessa was called Arabia. And then returned to Damascus. So he's really talking about, because, I mean, everything Saul and Josephus say is all about themselves. They're the hugest egotists ever. And so he's talking about himself when he was a kid. He went to Arabia. He went to Edessa. Galatians 1:15. So
yeah, I know. I think he's kind of trying to get his credentials up with his audience. Yeah. But I don't think he was at 17 years old in the middle of the argument on at the Council of Jerusalem.
Well, I think he would have been
a great, yeah, really.
Well,
yeah, yes. I don't buy that one.
Well, he went on his first tour under my timeline. He went on his first tour when he was 15, of course. But of course, he would have been a man because he had his bar mitzvah when he was 14. That's when he was teaching everybody in the temple, as Josephus says. He was teaching the high priest, just the same as Jesus was teaching the high priest in the temple when he was 12 or 13. They make this out to be a miracle, but of course, it's just a bar mitzvah. And at the bar mitzvah, you have to give a reading to the priest, or if you're very important, the high priest. And he's going to ask you some questions as to whether you understand the Torah or not. And that's what they're talking about. So that's what Josephus was saying when he was 14 and he was teaching the high priest. And that's what Jesus was saying. I forget what verse that is, when Jesus was found to be in the temple and he was amazing all the priests.
Right.
That's his bar mitzvah when he became a man. So Josephus would have been a man in 51 at his bar mitzvah. And then I have him on the first of the evangelical tours around the Mediterranean the next year in 52. So very young, yeah, of course, but he was still a man,
Yeah. Well, I have Paul out of the movement at 44 AD. Even on the traditional timeline where Paul would have been an older man, like what I think, he still would have been able to travel. He wouldn't have been that old in 60. I mean, he might have been 60 to 65 years old, but that's my age and I can still travel. So, he was probably in pretty decent health, but I don't think he was that young. I don't know.
When you get visited by a couple of Mormons, of course, you don't get old people. You get a couple of youngsters come around to your house.
True.
That's what they do over here anyway. And as I like to say, when they knock on my door, I don't shut the door in their face. I open the door and let them in, and shut the door behind them.
Yeah, and then they want to get out, right?
Yeah. Then they're crawling to get out of the door after I've had a go at them for
I did that
a couple of hours.
Okay, you kind of feel sorry for the people.
Oh, it's good sport. Because they often send these kids around who know nothing about their own history, let alone gospel history. So It's always a good sport. Yeah. Oh, well, that's all very interesting.
Yeah, I think we're looking at it. We're looking at a lot of the same events. I think a lot of them that I think are central to understanding, and I think you're looking at them the same way, except we're
one generation
I'm
apart.
looking at an earlier time period. You're looking at a later time period. But
there's a final question, I suppose. Could Jesus of Gamala be the son of Judas of Gamala, the Galilean? I mean, they both had the same titles. Could they be father and son?
Now, we only know
the sons of Judas were James and Simon, and of course
Menahem.
Well, yes, but that one doesn't match. I'm not sure who he is. But the brothers of Jesus, of course, were Simon and James as well. So we sort of have a family here. And could Judas have been the father of the Jesus of Gamala character?
I don't know.
It seems like, because they've got a family tradition as well, they seem to be, having the same revolution that Judas had, because Jesus of Gamala was blamed for the Jewish revolt, so he's being blamed in exactly the same fashion as Judas was. It seems to me that they're part of not just the same religious sect, but part of the same family.
I'm going to have to look into the Judas, you say Jesus of Gamala figure.
Yeah, because they both Judas the Galilean was Judas of Gamala. He has two titles. And Jesus of Gamala came from Galilee. So, I mean, they effectively have the same titles. Jesus of Gamala was the governor of Tiberias, and he owned a castle in Galilee. So he was Jesus of Galilee as well, the Galilean. And it just strikes me as being very, very similar, these two stories. And I don't think it's a story that's been repeated, because some of these stories, I think, have been duplicated. I think it's a family relationship, that we have a sort of father and son. That gives some difficulties for my story, because the father shouldn't have been in Judea. He was locked up in Edessa. The Romans wouldn't let him out. But it could have been, if it wasn't father and son, it could have been maybe uncle and nephew or something of that nature. I don't know. It's possible.
Yeah, I mean, anything's possible. I mean, we're kind of looking at events that most historians take. Looking at the Book of Acts, and they take it for granted that that's the gospel truth. But when you look at other sources, especially Josephus, you can see that many of the things there are like a reversal of what was probably actually happening. So it's like a huge puzzle. that we're trying
We
to.
have a lot of this because you have obviously two perspectives. You have different authors with a different perspective.
Right.
And just like today, if you read, or watch the difference between CNN and Fox News, they will report on one particular topic and have two entirely different stories with two entirely different perspectives, because they're looking at the same events from different lenses, and
Right.
that's effectively what we've got with many of these reports. Some people liked the Jesus character, some people didn't, and of course you get different reports because of that.
Well, I think after the Jewish War, the Judas the Galilean character was probably not.
Oh, he wasn't flavor of the month at all.
No, he was not, because even some of the Sicarii, the real fanatics, they went down to, was it Alexandria, and they tried to recruit the Jews there, and the Jews wanted nothing to do with them.
Yeah.
Because they knew that the Romans would just snuff them out. So there's one reason why the Gospels that we have today, they don't want to associate with a revolutionary. They want to associate with the Prince of Peace.
Yes,
because it was easy for the Romans to accept.
Yeah, same with the Talmud. I mean, secretly, because they sort of do it in code, they say that Jesus was guilty of the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem, and he should be boiled in semen and shit. Now, that was, because they knew that, they destroyed, their temple had been destroyed, but they also knew that Rome didn't appreciate this character either, because this character, even if you're saying it was Judas, the follow-on from Judas was the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem and the Jewish revolt. And so Rome was highly upset about all of this revolutionary business.
Mm-hmm. So the solution was to make a Messiah that pleased the Romans.
Of course, yes.
And that's what our Jesus of Nazareth figure is. He's not a historical person, but he's based on historical people.
Well, he could be a historical person if he was the leader of the Jewish revolt. And of course, according to Josephus, the leader of the Jewish revolt was Jesus of Gamala, Jesus the Galilean. He was one of the prime leaders of the Jewish revolt. So it could be talking about a revolutionary who was involved in the Jewish revolt. But of course, I think Rome wanted to cover that up.
I think he was more of a combination, the Jesus of Nazareth person. The three people that are crucified, isn't there a story in Josephus that talks about that being like at 70 AD?
Yes.
But then you have a Barabbas episode, and that's from 4 BC at the Golden Eagle Temple cleansing. So you've got this mixture in this story that are all being put into this character named Jesus of Nazareth. So I think there's more than just one person being put into that character. There was Jesus, the guy that was saying "Woe to Jerusalem," and he was hit in the head with a rock and killed. Paul would have been there.
Jesus Ananias, yes.
Yeah. Paul would have been in the city when he was going around saying these type of things. So it's like, but he's in the story of Jesus of Nazareth too, where Jesus says no to all this stuff. So it's
that's why I say he could have been multiple reports of the same person. So not necessarily separate characters that have been amalgamated, but different reports that people have said, oh, do you know this Jesus character? He was saying this all around Jerusalem. Because what he was saying, of course, lamenting the fate of Jerusalem, is exactly the same as in the Gospels, exactly the same.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just wondering if it was just a different story from a different source, and they didn't know that, so they put it as a different person. So we have multiple ways of interpreting this. But yeah, these characters are very, very similar to the gospel story. Very similar.
Right. Okay. You have anything else?
No, I think we've talked most of that out.
Hi guys, can you hear me?
Yeah, we're still here.
I was just going to ask you, before we finish today, could you just both of you briefly give us your thoughts on the Testimonium Flavianum and also on Tacitus's passage on Christos?
Oh, yes. Do you want to go first there on the first one, Daniel?
On the
Testimonium.
The Testimonium, I think that was originally about the death of Judas the Galilean, because that would explain why Josephus wrote about Judas and was saying that he was this great teacher, and that for the next 50 years, his teachings were growing. He talks about the deaths of his two sons by crucifixion. He talks about the death of another son, Menahem, in Jerusalem. He talks about his grandson at Masada, but yet he ignores the death of Judas the Galilean, who probably in the war would have been like the greatest figure of the whole group. But he doesn't talk about that. So I think that passage was originally about Judas the Galilean, and then it was changed, of course, to make it look like it's a passage about Jesus of Nazareth. So I don't know what, Ralph, what your take on that is.
I think it's just a complete interpolation, because it wasn't mentioned by Origen. It was only mentioned first by Eusebius, and he was known as being the most dishonest historian in the history of historians. And it doesn't read like the rest of the story. Josephus doesn't praise people in that fashion, especially if they're anti-Roman, because remember, Josephus was writing from a Roman perspective for his Roman patrons. He was sponsored by Vespasian, who was paying for this enterprise. And there's no way he would praise anyone who would have possibly, been anti-Roman in that fashion. And the other thing is, Josephus was writing in the AD 70s when the Gospels were being written, and therefore the Gospels would have mentioned this. If this passage was in Josephus, then surely the Gospel writers would have been mentioning it. And the other thing is that if you take it out, the entire passage reads much better. So we have a prologue, and then the story continues, and in the middle, sandwiched in the middle, we get the testimonium. If you just lift it out of the text, it actually matches up very nicely, as if someone has just placed this text in the middle of it.
Yeah, that's a possibility. But if it was about Judas the Galilean and it's been totally rewritten to what it is now, it's the same thing. It seems out of place, because Josephus never talked about Jesus of Nazareth, his life or anything that he did. So all of a sudden you're getting hit by this guy that supposedly, is this guy that, is just wonderful and all that stuff. But yet Josephus never mentioned him in any of his history.
Yeah, but with Judas the Galilean as well, he didn't like Judas the Galilean. He thought he was a despicable revolutionary who was, eventually responsible for.
But he still could have said that he was killed at this point. I mean,
yeah, but the testimonium sort of praises the Jesus character.
Yeah, but I don't think that part would have been.
Right.
I just think the whole thing is just a lift of one passage, a snip of it, and put another one in. To replace. I don't think they reworked a few words. I think it was pretty much taking everything out about Judas and putting the stuff in about Jesus. So, we're not that far off on that one.
No, it's certainly not something that could be trusted as a reliable source about, the gospel Jesus.
No. Let's see, what was
the other one, Paul?
And the other one was, how much credence do you give Tacitus's passage on Christus?
Oh yes, the Tacitus writes about Christus, but he doesn't write about Christus, of course, because the text actually said Christus until someone scrubbed out the E and put in an I, which you can see in the text. So the original said Christus, not Christus. And of course, if we're talking about Christus, that was a well-known epithet, I suppose you might say, a title, going back into the Ptolemies of Egypt. So Ptolemy III of Egypt was called the Christus. He had it on his coins. He had the Chi Rho, the Chi Rho of Christianity, the X and the P. That used to be on the bottom of his coins because it means the good. So it's not Christus, it's Christus, and it means the good. They used to put it in the margins of books as well, or scrolls, and they used to put Chi Rho there, and it marked a passage that was a good passage that you should read. So the Chi Rho and the Christus goes back long before Christianity, and so I don't think Tacitus was necessarily talking about a Christus at all. I think he was just talking about Christus, the good people, whoever he thought the good people
were. Are you which? Are you talking about the? Okay, the Great Fire of Rome. Is that the one you're talking about?
Yeah, he was talking about that, but he was also talking about. Let me look it up.
It's from Tacitus's last book, Annals, I believe.
Yes. Do you have a quote there, Paul?
I did have.
Lost it.
Typical, yeah. Bear with me one moment and I'll read it out. Give me 1 second. Right. Here we are. Okay, so it says, but all human efforts, all the lavish gifts of the emperor, and the propitiations of the gods did not banish the sinister belief that the conflagration was the result of an order. Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of the procurators, Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their centre and become popular. Accordingly, an arrest was first made of all who pleaded guilty. Then, upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of the crime of firing the city as of hatred against mankind.
Yeah, just a couple of other points on that. Remember, we do have two entirely different sects. So we have the Nazarene sect of Jesus and James, and then we have the simple Judaic Church of the Gentiles, which was the Church of Saul. And what I think was probably happening at the time is that the Rome was against the Nazarene because they were the revolutionaries, and the last thing Rome wanted was another revolution. And so the people who were being persecuted were the Nazarene Church of Jesus and James, while the simple Judaic Church of Saul was actually being promoted by Vespasian and Titus as a Rome-friendly form of Judaism that would neuter this revolutionary messianic Judaism. So if there was any persecution going on, it would be of the Nazarene Church, not of the Church of Saul, which became Christianity. So yeah, possibly there was persecution, but it wasn't of Christians, it was of the Nazarene Jews of Jesus and James. And the other, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Ralph, I totally agree with you on that. If they were two groups of Christians within, or whatever you want to call Christians at that time, the followers of James would have been the ones that were persecuted. Well, any of the followers of Paul, and there were some because he wrote to the churches in Rome, I think they could have been confused with the Jewish Christians, but unfortunately, that's too bad for them if they were. But I think even when you get into the second century, where you're talking some of the histories, there was a confusion from the other, and I think we need to look at it as being there were two distinct movements at that time. And the ones that were causing the trouble would have been the followers of James.
And the other thing is, with the fire of Rome itself, Josephus was probably there when the fire broke out. Remember, he had gone to Rome to see Nero, and he didn't come back, as far as I'm aware, until about AD 64/65. And so he would have been there during the fire of Rome, and he never mentions it. So I do wonder whether the fire was as big as Tacitus makes out.
I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, Josephus, everything. The only person that was important in the eyes of Josephus was Josephus Flavius, and so if he had this adversity of being there during the fire of Rome, he would have mentioned it, and he never mentions it at all, which is odd. But yeah, I think there was no persecution of the Christians, the Church of Saul, way up until 20, 30 years after the Jewish revolt. So they got a free ride from the Flavian emperors, Vespasian and Titus, and the next one, Domitian. Because Christianity, as it became, the Church of Saul, was useful. It was Rome friendly. It said, pay your Roman taxes. It said in the epistles, you'll probably know this better than I do, Daniel, your governors are appointed by God, and therefore you should obey your governors at all times. Well,
that's very Roman friendly.
It is. It's superbly Roman friendly. So of course, Rome wouldn't be against the Church of Saul whatsoever. It was ideal to neuter the church, the messianic revolutionary Church of Jesus and James, and so they would have been promoting it.
Yeah, I agree 100% with you on that.
So yeah, the claims by the church that they were persecuted at that time is just complete nonsense. Perhaps there was persecution going on, but it was against the Messianic Jews. And that there's a story I seem to remember. I can't remember the characters, but later on, 20 years later on from the Jewish revolt, and they're finding that they're still scouting around looking for these Messianic leaders, and they find a couple of them, and they plead poverty. We're not messianic. We're just spiritual nowadays. Look at our hands. These are the hands of workers of the land. They're not the hands of revolutionaries. And these two guys are let go eventually. So even then, they were still looking for these messianic revolutionaries in Judea. I forget who they were the sons of. They were the sons of someone important.
They were somehow related to Jesus.
Yes, somehow. I forget how they were
I'm not
related.
sure if they were the sons of maybe Judas or...
something like that. Yes.
Something, I'm not sure.
Sons of James or something, yeah.
Yeah. But, the problem with the interpretation of Christianity now is we buy the story of Acts, which makes it look like everything was an agreement between one group and the next. And like what Ralph was saying, by the time 70 AD rolls around and the destruction of the Jewish movement, there's only one, viable movement left, and that's the Pauline movement. There are what the Ebionites are, a small group,
Yes,
left over, and that's about it. And what we know of the history, after the war,
yeah,
because they would have been.
They had the flight to Pella, of course. So the Messianic Church of Jesus and James had their flight to Pella, which is over the Jordan into modern country of Jordan, and they were known as the Ebionites, and they called them something else as well. The Jewish Christians they were known as, and the Ebionites means the poor, so they were still known as the poor because the Church of Jesus and James was the poor.
Right, and they also were very anti-Paul.
Oh yes, utterly.
Yeah,
they
utterly.
were.
So you can see the difference, from that point, and I think it, started in the early 40s. The difference there when they discovered out what Paul was teaching. Once they figured that out, his movement was not going to be with the other movement, the one of James.
Oh yes, eventually totally at whatever date it was, they were at each other's throats. Right. And of course, it was Peter who was sitting on the fence as usual, and he was the one who was being, happily Pauline when it suited him, and then when the hardliners came up from Jerusalem, suddenly he became Messianic Jewish again and was eating kosher. He was just a fence sitter, and that he would. Bend with the wind, you might say, much as Paul was saying about himself. He was no better, of course. He was doing exactly the same.
Right. He even admitted that when he was with the Jews, he acted like a Jew, and he was with the Gentiles, he acted like a Gentile. Yes. And you would never teach your children to do that. You'd say, be an honest person, be yourself. Yep. That's not the way he worked. Very much.
That's why the church wants to reject the Sauline, even though they were descended from the Sauline church. They want to reject their primary prophet, I suppose, their first pope, because he was such a slimy character, and he was known as the liar all the way through, and he was duplicitous. I mean, it's just not the character you would want as being your primary disciple.
Right. We're in total agreement on that, Ralph.
Any other questions there, Paul?
I think that's just about it, Ralph. To be honest, we're 1 hour and 41 minutes into this now, so
okay, we've gone over.
Go on forever, no doubt. But I'll tell you what, that has to be the most interesting discussion on the historical Jesus that I've ever listened to.
All right, that's totally good.
That was absolutely fascinating. So, big thank you to both of you guys for sharing your knowledge today on my channel. Remember, viewers, both guys have written amazing books on this subject, so if you haven't done already, please go over to Amazon, start checking them out. I think the parallels between both of your theses are absolutely fascinating, even though you place the historical Jesus in a different time, a different era, etc. The parallels are there, and you're definitely onto something. So thank you so much for coming on with me today. Viewers, please like, share, subscribe. Really helps the channel out. Thank you, Ralph. Thank you, Daniel.
Thanks very much for having us.